start recording. And so yeah, today it's just introduction to video game design. I also have these notes, so you can follow along on the notes, or you can look at them later, or you can just look at them on the screen. I have like a little button to turn them into slides, so it looks like I'm doing a real lecture, but it's the same content either way. And so for today, we're going to be looking at just some really basic terms of what we use when we talk about video games. So you guys are probably familiar with a lot of these terms. You might not be familiar with some of the terms. That's okay. But basically, just creating like terms that we can use, like a shared language, so that when I talk about something in design or when I'm demonstrating on a program, you guys will understand what I'm talking about. So it's really just like terminology and getting used to talking about how video games work and what their components are and things like that. And feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions or want me to repeat something, or if you have an example that it reminds you of. Anything that you want to contribute is cool. Let me make sure I'm still streaming this. Oh, I'm not. Okay. Whoops. Sorry. I'm gonna stream my screen for Sonora. Okay. Okay. So that's a video game controller. You guys have all seen that before. But the reason I show that, and the thing that I want to kind of emphasize with this, is just the basic idea of interaction. Interaction is the thing that makes video games different from other types of media, and it adds this like very complex layer to creating something that completely changes the way that we approach it. It completely changes the way we talk about it. It's the thing that we have to really be thinking about all of the time. So even when we're making art or making sound or creating a narrative, we always need to be thinking about interaction and how games are interacting. So yeah, that's kind of the main thing. That's what makes this class its own class versus graphic design or music or animation. This is our basic video games feedback system. This is my very rushed, quick drawing that I did. But we can see these are the basic components of any video game system that we need to be aware of. We have, our senses, like our eyes and our ears, and in some cases our, hands or our whole bodies. And then we have input. So we, hit buttons or use different types of inputs. You could use sound, different things like that. That gets interpreted by the game system, and then that changes the feedback that we get. So it's this constant cycle that's happening of feedback and input. So when we're creating a video game, things that we want to keep in mind, and we're going to be obviously starting to think about things as video game designers, right? So we can talk about how video games work from the perspective of playing a video game, but we want to start thinking about the game from the perspective of a designer. How do we design a video game? So when we're thinking about interaction in a video game, the system of interaction, so the way that we perceive the information and then what we input back to the game, should encourage exploration and understanding of the interface. Okay, so the interface is going back to this thing. That's the interface, right? It's on the screen as well, but that's what we have to input. And that's all we really need. Like, we have a lot more complex ways of interacting with video games now. But this is pretty much everything we need, right? We just need a couple buttons and arrow pad, and the interface also kind of tells us what we're supposed to do with the game. With the Nintendo, we have one side where we can just move. Like, it's very obvious from the design what we're supposed to do with the thing on the left. We move our character. And then on the right side, we only have two options. So it's pretty quickly we can figure out what does the first option do, what does the second option do, what does it do when we press them together, different combinations. So that's exploration of the interface. And so the game should lead us to explore the interface. It should lead us to say, what happens if I hit this button? What happens if I, use the joystick or whatever? So then, separate from that, it should encourage exploration within the game world. And the game world can be lots of different things. When we say game world, you're probably picturing like, Zelda or something like that, like trees and whatever. But it also means like a chessboard or the Tetris map or whatever. The game world is just the world of the game, whatever those boundaries are, and the things that exist within those boundaries. And so again, the system of interaction should encourage us to explore that world, to understand what are the limits of that world and what can I do in the world. And then finally, allow the user to master the tools of the game. So these all sound very obvious and simple, but they're really important principles. Game design is really hard because there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And not only do we have to create all this stuff and put it in the game, that takes enough time on its own, but then we have to figure out how is the user going to interact with this. So it's not enough to just draw stuff that looks really cool, have really cool levels and stuff like that. We also have to know how is the user going to understand the tools that we give them to experience the game that we're creating. Basic stuff, input, we have a keyboard, we have a mouse, we have a gamepad. There's also a voice or sound that we can, use in our game system. 3D sensing with the Kinect or the Wii, light sensing, arcade guns, other types of haptic sensors, some basics. And then output, we have the screen, but we also have, other types of output, sound, obviously haptics again. My slide doesn't quite fit in here. Okay, so the game uses feedback to communicate information to the player about the state of the game. Okay, so that sounds like it's like taking what's happening in the moment to moment, frame by frame experience of a game and just describing very literally what's happening. So a game system has all these different states that it's keeping track of, like where the player is, how many levels have they gone through, how many points do they have. There's all these different little things that the game is remembering for us, essentially. And then everything it's doing is using those states to communicate to us where we are in the game. And then we use our knowledge about those states to, change our feedback to either progress through the game or restart the game or, interact with what's happening in the game. So that's important in terms of like terminology. Like I'll say the thing like game state, like constantly. Like everything in the game is basically just a state. Like where are you in the game? How many things are there around you? Like all these different things that the game is keeping track of for us. Those are game states. So yeah, the level, score, metrics. Like these are the obvious things that are communicated to us very directly. Like you are on level 1. You have 50% health. All of those things are different game states. And all of those things are things that we're going to have to keep track of as game designers, not just like what are they and how many of them are there and how do they work together, but also how does the player know what all of these things are? Are we just literally showing them, or do we have to show them by different visuals or different sounds, all of the different ways that we can communicate with the user? Information about other players in the game world. Of course, if it's a multiplayer game, it's important. And other actors in the game world. So things that change, like the difficulty level, enemies, all these different things that can be kind of changing. Those are actors in the game world. So when we're talking about communicating states to the player, one term that you'll hear me use a lot is positive feedback. And this is kind of a confusing term because positive here doesn't necessarily mean like it's nice and happy and good. It means more like it's constructive, that it leads to some kind of advancement. So positive feedback could be like you die or your heart explodes or something like that in the game. It doesn't sound positive, but it is positive feedback if it communicates something to the player. So when the player falls off a cliff in Mario or something, that's positive feedback because it tells them you're not allowed to, if you fall off the cliff, you're going to lose a life or you're going to end the game. So even though it's a negative thing that we're experiencing as the player, it's positive feedback in the sense that it should teach us something about what's happening how the game is keeping track of these states. Something that's not positive feedback is if you run into an invisible wall and you can't keep going. That's not positive feedback because it doesn't tell the player. It's confusing. It doesn't tell the player what's going on and how they can improve their gameplay to get past the wall. So positive feedback is what's going to motivate your player. So if your player, some people, may not really care, like, oh, I fell off the cliff, so this sucks, I quit. But most people will be like, well, I want to try again. I want to jump across the gap, and then I'll keep going. So it's a motivation for players. And then on the flip side, confusing or discouraging feedback is a demotivating. It's not going to help. It's not going to make the player want to keep playing the game. They don't understand what's happening or why things are happening. So as I said, losing the game or losing a level, even though we're losing, it is a form of positive feedback. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about game mechanics. So game mechanics is a term that gets used a lot, and it kind of gets used to talk about lots of different things, and they kind of all are game mechanics. But the sort of like literal definition when we say game mechanics is the system of rules that governs the way the user interacts with the game. And those rules usually should combine. They should be like simple rules that are easy to learn, and they usually should combine together to make something that's a lot more interesting. So the most like easy classic example of this is chess. Chess has very, very specific, very simple rules. You have like certain types of pieces and they have certain types of movements, and that's all you have to know, basically. But those mechanics work together to create a very complicated game. And so the mechanics refer to that system of rules. The game designer creates the rules, and then the player has to learn the rules to achieve whatever their goals are for that game. So within that sort of basic game mechanics, the interface allows the user to make actions. Okay, so continuing the chessboard is an interface. It has the rules, visually built into it, and it allows physically, in this case, the user to do the actions of the game. And then the game records those actions and makes decisions based on the input and environment. So the chessboard kind of records the actions in the sense that the pieces are still just there, so you can see where they are, or if they're not there. But the computer can do a more sophisticated version of that, where it can keep track of lots of different information about different players, about different inventories, different parts of the story, all of these different things that we can, the computer can do a lot more work in terms of keeping track of all of these elements. And then feedback is given to the user as the game states change. So if you beat a level, there's going to be some feedback that tells you you beat this level. Go to the next level, there's going to be some feedback that explains that. So the user interprets that feedback, and then they adjust their approach to the game based on what that feedback is. And that keeps going. It's this endless cycle until we either fall asleep or beat the game or whatever. So that's game mechanics. Those are the rules and how they work together. Game dynamics is a little bit of a different concept. That's the product of the game mechanics. And the game dynamics is how you would describe the experience or the progress of the game. So again, in chess, you have the rules for how you can move, but then the dynamics have to do with how does the game progress over time. So there's certain rules that determine how you're supposed to play the game, and those rules lead to different types of interactions. And that's kind of the tricky part of game design that we'll see as we create levels and stuff like that. This balance between dynamics and mechanics. So mechanics are the rules, and the dynamics are sort of the outcome or the result of those rules. And what a game designer is really doing all the time is balancing those mechanics and then looking at, okay, if I make the player, twice as fast, how does that change the progress that they make through the game. Does it make the game easier or harder, more fun, less fun? All of these different things. So tweaking one rule may lead to very different game dynamics. So in games with good dynamics, the rules of the game are easy to learn, not necessarily easy to master. You'll hear that if you read any book about game design or watch any YouTube video about game design. That's what people are going for. The rules should be easy to understand and easy to learn, but not easy to master. It takes a long time to get really good at chess or Tetris or Mario, any of these games, any classic game. The rules are simple and motivating, hopefully, but they're not. It's not easy to become, the best chess player ever just by learning the rules. It requires lots of gameplay to understand how the rules work together. The user is in direct control of the game avatar. Like kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised how you can not do this exactly correctly. Basically, this means that the user has to understand what they're doing in the world and what they can control, and how this system works, basically what they're looking at versus what buttons they're pressing. This isn't that, it seems obvious, but it's easy to mess up. Players improve through gameplay. This is kind of the same thing as the first one, but as you play the game, you should get better at it, essentially, and then that's where the dynamics come in. As you get better, you realize that there's more complexity, so then there's more stuff that you have to figure out. Theoretically, hopefully, if you're making a good game. Immediate feedback is another important one, another one that seems kind of obvious, but if something happens, you should understand the consequences of whatever action that you do in the game immediately. Like there should be a sound, there should be a change in graphics, should be this like constant feedback. And then sufficient feedback. This is basically just that there's enough feedback from the game for us to understand what just happened. So a lot of times when you're first creating a game, you might not always have a sound effect to go along with every action. And maybe that'll be okay, but if you look at most games that are really fun, usually there's like everything has its own sound, everything has its own little action, like everything gives you feedback about what's happening, and gives you specific feedback. So sufficient feedback means it's not just like a sound, say you jumped, but it's a sound that communicates, you jumped or you landed on something. Like it communicates exactly what happened, so you can not only see but hear. Like everything is kind of unified in the feedback that we're getting from the game. And then the game allows recovery from mistakes. So this is important with a lot of video games. A game will kind of show you like you can do this, you can do that. But if you screw up, you have to be able to take risks. Essentially, that's a lot of what makes a game fun. Is that you can try, doing something in the game, and then you might die or you might lose or whatever, but you get a chance to try again. So pretty much all video games work that way. There are like some examples of games that deteriorate over time, or that you can only play once and stuff like that. But the huge majority of games have this component built into them, where you can recover from mistakes that you make in the game. Okay, so the last sort of big important part, and this is what we'll talk about a ton throughout the semester, is goals, obstacles, and rewards. So these are really obvious, simple ideas, but these three elements are really what make pretty much all of game design. When you're creating different components of your game, balancing these things is really important. So goals are, pretty obvious. That's just what's the goal of the game. So looking at like, Mario, the goal of the game is to get to the end of the level, and then get to the end of the next level and, get the most points, et cetera, et cetera. But usually the goal should really be obvious, and it should really immediately be to the player. That's what motivates most players, is to achieve whatever that goal is. Some games obviously have like goals that are outside of the game, like social goals, like having the highest score on a website or something like that, or beating your friends at the game. But games should have their own internal goals that should be communicated very clearly. So Mario is a good example. There's just like a flag at the end of the level. You're just trying to get there. So it's really obvious what you're trying to do. Um, doesn't have to be that obvious, but it always has to be clear. So even if you're making a game where there it's not just a linear like go from left to right, maybe you're exploring a space or something like that. It should still be clear. What am I trying to do here? Like, what's the point? Um, yeah, in here we see the goal is the flag at the end of the level. Rewards, the little question mark, you might get like a power up, something like that. And then obstacles like the gap in the platform or the Goomba enemy that will take one of your lives. So a lot of times these things are kind of like woven together in different ways. Obstacles and rewards will lead the player towards the goal. So if you enter a world and there's like a big open space and then you see some blinking like coins, you'll be like, oh, I should go get those coins. Or if you see like a scary bad guy and they're in front of like a some other platform or some other space that you can get to, that's another way of saying like there's this scary bad guy over there, but there's nothing else to do, so you should probably go over to the scary bad guy. So both obstacles and rewards can be used to kind of lead the player through the game and communicate the goals to the player. Um, and then they also provide challenges. So there's a goal, but there's also challenges that lead along to the goal. So a lot of games, they'll be like if you're playing Mario, you can just go straight across and just try to beat the level. But there's also other challenges that you might want to do if you're good at the game or if you want to experience more parts of the game. There might be some coins that are really high up that you have to jump to get to. There may be some enemies that you could avoid or you can attack them. So obstacles and rewards are used in different ways, both to challenge the player, but also to lead them towards the goal. So usually we'll have like some specific ones. Complex games have a lot of different obstacles and rewards. They may also have multiple goals. So if you've played like big AAA video games, usually they have a lot of different missions. Some of them will be required, some of them won't be required, some of them side missions. Usually, the more complex a game is, the more it'll kind of blend these things together. So goals are pretty simple, just objectives for the player to progress through a game or win the game. Mini games, as I mentioned, have a main goal or several side goals. And goals can be kind of compounded to create a complex series of events. So, reaching like one boss at the end of the level and then a final boss at the end of the game, that type of thing. You guys are probably very familiar with. Obstacles are just anything that prevents the player from getting to the goal. So again, very simple, but pretty much everything in a game falls into one of these categories. So an obstacle can be any type of challenge. So it could be a puzzle, it could be enemies, it could be anything that's basically preventing you from getting to the goal of the game. So that has a lot to do with the genre of the game, and we'll talk about that more as we kind of go, like what different types of conventions are used in different genres of. So yeah, as I mentioned, all of these things are usually related to the game genre. There's some conventions you might kind of play with those conventions. Obviously, if you're playing a puzzle game, most of the obstacles are going to be puzzles, but they, might have other things in there as well. Obstacles also can be more abstract, like it might not just be like a puzzle that's sitting directly in front of you. It may be finding, kind of like putting together some sort of like mystery or choosing, different branches of a story to figure out how to get to the end of the game. So then rewards are pretty much anything in the game that you get as a kind of like sign of achievement. So rewards can help you. Rewards can kind of do two different things. One is it tells you you're doing a good job. So if you're getting a lot of like coins as you're playing through Mario, you know that you're doing well. But they can also give you sort of power ups or things like that that can help you beat obstacles. So they kind of have those two different functionalities within a game. So part of it is showing you you're doing a good job. The other part of it is like, oh, if I get this like special item, it's going to make it easier for me to defeat the enemies or to get through certain obstacles. So yeah, rewards will affect the gameplay. So these are again just like different states. So you get a reward and it'll reveal a new part of the game. It might be like getting a key to open a door to a new area of the game. Some rewards also are just aesthetic, like you get a new skin for the character or something like that. So you might be motivated by achieving those types of rewards as well. They might not actually help you play the game, but you still might, enjoy having new aesthetics or new visual components. Okay, so there's a few links here if you're interested in looking into this stuff more. Sort of different sources that I looked at for talking about these concepts. So positive feedback. This gamedeveloper.com, it used to be called something else. What did it used to be called? Oh, it used to be called gamasutra.com, I think. Anyway, they have a lot of really good articles, a lot of different bloggers who write about game design. So a lot of the stuff I'll link to, like it'll be good resources, not just the article that's linked to, but also the source that it comes from. This is an article that's kind of about interaction design, but it talks more generally about how game design works and how it's kind of related to design in general. So there's some good examples in here of basically feedback systems. People talk about gamification a lot in things outside of games, like using the sort of goal, obstacle, reward system of games to motivate people to do things. So that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Oh yeah, this one is kind of a more technical thing. I made a PDF because some of the article is kind of old and some of the images aren't there anymore. But you can see like the system thing. But there's also, yeah, there's some more kind of like specific details about game design elements and rules and stuff like that that are kind of interesting in here. So that's a good article. This is a good article talking about accessible games and thinking about accessibility in game design. I think it's a good thing. It kind of makes you think outside of like the general game conventions that we're used to think about other ways that you might design a game and how that might change the game dynamics and stuff like that. And it's a good thing to think about just in general in terms of game patterns and how people interact with systems. That's also on the gamedeveloper.com. So yeah, I'll usually include some links to stuff that I was interested in or reading or just think are cool. These aren't like required readings, but they're things that you guys might want to look at on your own time if you want to get deeper into some of these topics. Cool. So yeah, that's game design. That's our little intro. The main thing that we really want to take away from that is just those like these different terms. So like positive feedback, I'll talk about that a lot. Just in terms of like giving feedback to the player, game mechanics versus game dynamics, like those two terms just get used a ton when talking about game design, but understanding how they work together and what they specifically mean is helpful. And then goals, obstacles, and rewards, that's what we'll be talking a lot about throughout the semester as we build different parts of our game. So what's the goal of the game? What are the obstacles? What are the rewards? How do they all fit together? So those are the terms that I want you guys to take away from this that I'll be using a lot in demos and other lectures as well. Okay, so let me stop recording.